I used to enjoy sieges in previous Total War games, but things changed quite drastically with Total War Warhammer 1 back in the day, and are now even worse I think in Total War Warhammer 3. I find sieges boring, frustrating, and quite simply a chore to have to do, and a lot of the stuff here applies to minor settlement battles as well, as they are equally boring, frustrating, and a chore. So here's everything I think is wrong with sieges and minor settlements. This is just my personal opinion, although I know a fair amount of the community I believe feels the same from comments I get and conversations I've had with people. So while it might be too late for any drastic changes to Total War Warhammer, there is hope for the future Total Wars to maybe make sieges great again. So what's wrong with sieges in Total War Warhammer? Well, let's start with the elephant in the room, the mammoth in the lounge. It is, of course, the supply system with the pop-up towers and pop-up barricades. It's the first time we're seeing this system in Total War, and hopefully it's the last, because I don't think it fits the game at all, especially the pop-up arrow towers, which almost feel a bit reminiscent of Fortnite building a tower out of nowhere. And then there's these barricades and blockers which don't actually really block anything because they can be smashed to bits in about a minute or two by some goblins potentially, so they don't really hold anything back or push the enemy in any particular direction. They just don't have enough HP to be useful. And the same with the firing platform. The two that give buffs and debuffs are a little bit better. You can pull some strategic plans and try to force the enemy to fight on those, so those are a little bit better, but this whole system just doesn't provide much in the way of tactics and strategy because, well, there's pretty much just one strategy with it, and that is to build the tower as close to the enemy as possible. And hey, it doesn't matter if the enemy goes somewhere else, you can just build a tower over there in 30 seconds as well. So it's an incredibly forgiving system that if you place a tower badly, it doesn't matter because you can just build another one. Whereas if the tower is in a fixed position, you have to find a way to force the enemy to come and fight near it to make use of it. Also, the higher tier towers can be very powerful and pretty much just wipe out the enemy army for you, and you just have to do nothing but hold them in front of it. So overall, the whole system just feels like there's less strategy required to do anything in sieges and minor settlements. And remember those three words as we move through this video. The other problem with barricades, aside from them not being very strong, is the weird placement. Like in this minor settlement battle, why can I only block up one side of two choke points? I should be able to block up both, because then I could put two blockers up and put no men over there and just have the blockers hold them back for a while to buy me some time while I take out the rest of their army, which is maybe on the other side of the map. Or I could put two firing platforms there and just have some missiles rain down on them for a bit before they come up and start bashing on the barricade. There's tactics I could pull there, but when one side is left open, I have to commit a unit, and then the other barricade's kind of useless anyway, especially as they'll probably bash it down in about 4 seconds. By far the most frustrating thing with barricades though is when you're attacking one as an attacker trying to bash your way through it, but then the enemy unit can just walk straight through it and start attacking your unit that's attacking it, and thus it stops you attacking it, so the barricade just stays there forever until you get rid of the unit, who at any point could just retreat through the barricade magically because it physically doesn't exist for them, but it does for you, and it just requires too much suspension of disbelief. And I know it's a video game and a fantasy video game, but having a massive wooden barricade that can be walked through by some but not by others is just really fucking silly. In the same way that having an arrow tower constructed in less than a minute is also pretty fucking silly. One thing I do kind of like with the supply system though is the fact that there's a lot of checkpoints all over the map. And as an attacker, if you capture them all, you capture and win the settlement, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're taking a city, you take it apart at a time. Whereas the defender, your only reason to defend these points is so that your towers and things don't get destroyed and so you keep getting supplies, but when you don't really like the supply system and you don't want arrow towers to simply win the battle for you, it doesn't make you want to go and defend them. Imagine if there was a system where if you lost a supply point, you lost 5 leadership for every single one, or maybe 10 leadership as a defender. And if you're the attacker, you gain 5 leadership. And perhaps as a defender, if you reclaim the points, you gain your leadership back, but also take 5 off the enemy, because realistically, it would be demoralizing to an attacking army to lose a piece of territory that they'd previously gained. So it feels like there could be a cool system in there somewhere by having multiple points all over the map. And I know this system is kind of cool because it was in previous Total Wars. There were points on the map, not very many, but if you took it, you would gain a leadership buff. So it gave you a reason to fight over something and to move around the siege map rather than just sitting in one place. There might also be a case for getting rid of victory points in sieges, the place that once you take it, the settlement is magically yours and the entire 20-stack army that might be there will just go, oh, okay, we'll leave now then. Even though we've still got twice the troops you do, we'll go home because you took that one area of our settlement. It's just kind of silly and doesn't make sense, and is something that's been in pretty much every Total War, so that's nothing new really, but it would be something that I'd like to see maybe some other stuff tried out for. Like a system where you have to capture every part of the map to truly control a settlement. Maybe that would make Sieges a bit too long-winded though, so who knows. But let's move on now and talk about the choke point fest that Sieges and minor settlements have become, as it seems like there's very little open space a lot of the time, and thus everything is a choke point. Choke point here, 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 choke point here. Choke point here, 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 choke point here. You get the idea. Both Sieges and minor settlement maps have this problem where pretty much everything's a choke point all over the place. We're not allowed any room to move our units around tactically. We're just forced to go into choke point battles all the time. Why not remove this random little rock face and just have a nice big open space where a few units can actually move around and potentially flank each other, and then cool, have a choke point. And then maybe open up the space again. Get rid of this. Maybe you could just make the whole area wider. Just make it a nice semicircle area you can actually have a fight in. Or maybe over here, we've got all this stuff, just remove this, remove all of this, and let's just have a nice big open space where we can actually use our units and all their abilities. And then have a couple of choke points around that lead up here, and maybe this could be an open area. Get rid of these buildings, a nice little platform up here where we could have a little fight, move our units around a bit, so we're not just constantly stuck in choke points, unable to utilize half of what our army can do. It's just constant small battles of attrition. Again, this is nothing greatly new to Total War Warhammer, as other previous Total Wars did have some pretty choke point heavy maps, but it's somehow more boring in Warhammer than it is in, say, Rome 2, for reasons I'll talk about later. Now to the point for me where Sieges really died, and that's with the walls and how they've changed in Total War Warhammer to be pretty much a non-obstacle. And this is because of a few big changes that Total War Warhammer made over its predecessors, the first one being ass ladders. Why do I call them ass ladders? Because that's the only place they could possibly be storing these ladders that again they magically carry to the walls and every infantry unit has. In previous Total Wars, you had a finite amount of ladders, and they were like any other siege equipment that you had to push or carry up to the wall to actually deploy it. So you'd get maybe 3 or 5 lots of ladders, a couple of siege towers and a battering ram, and that was your siege equipment. So you'd normally have more ladders than you would siege towers, but of course, ladders don't provide much cover, so the units could be shot, and that provided some tactics and strategy. As the defender, you could try and shoot the ladder units because they were more easily shot, or you could try and burn their ladder with some fire arrows. And as the attacker, you'd have to try not to get your ladder boys completely shot to death. So there was some tactics and strategy there, but with everybody having ass ladders, and the walls being accessible by any infantry unit, even though they do take a fatigue penalty for using them, it still means there's less strategy required to scale the walls and get your units inside. Thus, the walls are actually less of an obstacle. And this ties into our next point of magic elevators that units can use to get down from the walls at any point along it. It's easy to get up on the walls, it's easy to get down from the walls. Thus, the walls are not really an obstacle. Honestly, when I first played Warhammer 1, I couldn't believe this change from previous Total Wars, where there would be an actual point and a staircase units would have to go down to get off the wall. So now, less strategy required, for attackers especially, to get off the wall. So walls are a bit of a non-obstacle. How about doors though? The gates of the settlement, are they an obstacle? No, they're not. To demonstrate how useless gates of a settlement are, let's talk about ass rams, battering rams I said, which happen to be stored in the rectum of all units in the game, just like the ass ladders, because while battering rams will indeed take doors down very quickly, pretty much any unit is capable of quickly taking down a door, and they'll get there way before a battering ram ever will. Don't believe me? Here's a little demonstration of a Chaos Ram going for a door. I've started it as close to the door as possible, and I've done the same thing with a unit of doggos who can Vanguard deploy, but they are but a mere unit of doggos. Of course, they are going to reach the door first, and they're going to start chomping away, chomping the health off very quickly. The battering ram, nowhere near the door yet. That's to be expected. Cool. But as these doggos have now bitten and scratched their way through these gates, where the hell did the High Elves buy these gates? How's the battering ram doing? Oh, it's not even at the door yet. Thus, you get the point that battering rams are literally completely useless because every unit can take a door down, especially units with siege attackers, lords on mounts, monstrous infantry monsters. So with every unit being capable of bringing out their ass rams to knock down a door, it renders not only battering rams useless, but also the gates themselves absolutely useless because they can't stop anything for more than 1 or 2 minutes. Again, older Total Wars did it much better where gates actually meant something. We'll get to that a little later. And we must recite our mantra once again, less strategy required with gates because even a single unit of dogs can take them down. Onto another thing I've disliked since Warhammer 1, the range of towers in siege defenses. They leave the attacker pretty much no choice but to rush up and attack straight away, because the tower range is right to the edge of the map in some cases, so you literally can't stand anywhere without being blasted to pieces. So there's less strategy and tactics available because you simply have to rush up. That's the only choice, even if you're playing an army that doesn't really like to rush up too much. Maybe you want to use all your artillery and stuff to blast some holes in the wall, but you can't because you're just going to get shot. Maybe you want to move your army to a different part of the settlement to attack a different area, but if you do, you're going to be getting shot the whole time, and thus it's not worth it. You should just go forward. Now, in fairness to Warhammer 3, there are some areas where you won't get shot and you can sit back and use your artillery. And there is definitely some space on some maps, and it's better than Warhammer 2 was, where you pretty much had no space anywhere. So you got a bit of room to move laterally here, but for the most part, if you're over in these kind of corners on this map, you are going to be getting shot. So there's only one game plan: go forward. Whereas previous Total Wars, wall defense tower range was pretty short, thus you had time to set yourself up and attack as you'd like without having to rush. And to my final complaint, which is a less of an important one, but big maps are sometimes a little bit too much. And I know I was probably one of those complaining that maps were too small in previous Warhammers, and some of them definitely were, but a lot of them were just about right. And I think it's more that I was complaining that it felt too small and too tight because there were so many choke points. And with huge maps like this, Nangao, it by all means looks fantastic. They've done an amazing job with the visuals of it. But when I fight in it with a 20-stack army versus a 20-stack army, it just feels kind of empty and unalive. And I think the big thing that we were all calling for was 360 sieges rather than bigger maps. And well, we haven't quite got 360 sieges, we've got 360 minor settlement battles and kind of 3-sided sieges, which is fine. I don't think that's a huge issue that we don't have full 360 sieges like in previous Total Wars. It would be nice, but not essential. I understand there's probably some limitations there with AI and their pathfinding. But with making this video, I tried to ask myself, what exactly is it I'm trying to take away from the Siege experience? What do I enjoy about them? What do I want from it? I think what it is that I'm kind of imagining a movie-style siege in my head when I play Total War Sieges. Think the Battle of Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, or Minas Tirith, or the Battle for Jerusalem in Kingdom of Heaven, the Siege of Paris in Vikings, or even the Battle of Winterfell in Game of Thrones, although maybe don't let the AI control your cavalry like they did in that battle. I'm imagining this epic war across the entire cities or landscapes of lots of fighting going everywhere. So when I play these big old Warhammer 3 sieges and there's just a little bit of fighting in a couple of places near the walls, it just feels pretty underwhelming. Especially as I feel like I maybe did have that experience in older Total Wars, like Rome 2, Shogun 2, Shogun 2 especially actually, because you very often would get men just scattered all over the place and there was fighting going on across most of the settlement. And it really just felt like your army was all fighting together for the same cause, trying to survive this wave of attackers, and it just felt as epic as all those movie scenes, which I want Total War Sieges to feel like. So what can be done? Well, here's a few ideas that are entirely just what I would like to see. I'm sure not everyone wants to see these, and some people are maybe happy with the sieges the way they are, and that's fine. You're entitled to your wrong opinion. It's okay. But one thing we do have to understand with Total War Warhammer Sieges is that they do fit the idea of Total War Warhammer as a whole. It's a much faster paced Total War, more streamlined, simplified, dumbed down, whatever you want to call it. It's built obviously to appeal to more people, and the sieges fit that idea. However, that doesn't mean they're good and we have to like them. So we can hope that future Total Wars won't suffer the same fate as Total War Warhammer Sieges, being so utterly streamlined that half the stuff, the walls, the doors, the battering rams are useless, and thus strategy and tactics are going half out the window. The things I'd like to see in Total War Sieges is the stuff that's been done before, for the most part. If we take a look at Shogun 2 first of all, the siege maps aren't huge and there's lots of open space. In fact, they're pretty much just open space. And I'm not saying that this is a good idea for the future of Total War, but it is nice to have the open space. But you could argue that, well, it looks a bit silly because there's only one building and this is an entire town or city. What is there, 500 people living in this one building? Kinda seems a bit funny as an entire siege, right? But with Shogun 2, it was all about managing your units on the wall, getting them in the right position, trying to damage the enemy's strongest units as much as possible before they arrived with missiles and whatever else. And when they reach the walls, you pull them back and put your melee units up front. And that's kind of like every Total War, but having the space to actually easily move the units around made it a much more enjoyable experience. Similar to Total War Warhammer though, the walls weren't really much of an obstacle because they were built slanted as an anti-earthquake measure, I think. So it wasn't really about stopping people from getting up the walls because they were going to. It was simply about trying to get the right matchups when they did get to the top of the walls. Another thing that made Shogun 2 Sieges more fun was the multi-layered settlements as well. 2 or 3 sets of walls that an attacker would have to overcome to get to the top to get to the victory objective. This meant that you could fight down on the first level until the enemy started to overrun you, and then you would fall back to the second level, try to make good use of your firing positions and wear down the enemy so that by the time they got to the top, if they did get there, they would be nearly done and you could just finish them off at the top. I think Shogun 2 though somehow did give me that kind of movie siege vibe because there was so much fighting all over the place. You could have half of the settlement absolutely covered in bodies, and even though there was no siege equipment, there was so many men coming at you and coming over the walls, it did really feel like you were properly under siege, whereas I don't quite really get that with Total War Warhammer for some reason. Shogun 2 also had arrow towers that were just part of the settlement, and they could be captured by either side, so they could be a benefit to both attacker and defender, and thus there was a good reason to fight over them. So they provided some strategic value to fight for, whereas in Warhammer 3, they're just destroyed when the attacker takes them. But overall, Shogun 2 Sieges are somehow way more fun than Warhammer 3 Sieges, even though they do share some similarities. And take a moment to admire the attention to detail with these sync kills here. Now to Rome 2 and some of the things that used to do which I really liked in Sieges. First of all, you could actually use your artillery without being rushed by unlimited range defensive towers. And would you believe it, actual ladders that physically exist that need to be pushed and they aren't stored in men's arses, and you only have a finite number of them, so if you lose them you ain't getting up the walls that easy. There was also different siege towers, light, medium, heavy siege towers, light, medium, heavy rams and galleys, all this different siege equipment that made it fun to use. And rams actually mattered, because this is what you had to do if you wanted to take down a door otherwise. You had to throw a load of fiery sticks at it to light it on fire, which took a few minutes anyway, and then you'd have to wait for the fire damage to actually burn the door down, and that would take a few more minutes, so it would take a good old while to actually take down a door. You can see damage 11%, 12%, it's going up slowly, but you gotta wait for it. In the meantime, your men are all slowly dying and being shot to death. This was the penalty of using men to open a door, so battering rams really mattered. And as I say, for the defender, there was more chance to shoot enemies moving up while they push these ladders slowly, as when it's only siege towers you can't really hurt anybody, you can only try to take out the siege tower, which doesn't really work with arrows, so there was just a bit more to be doing from the defensive side than Warhammer. And then there was all the pre-battle deployables that you could literally drag and drop onto the map wherever you liked. Barricades, fiery balls, spikes, pits, you name it, you could throw it down as a siege defense. And it had to be placed there before the battle started. You couldn't just pop up an arrow tower out of fucking nowhere. This is how deployables should be in Total War in my opinion. Deployed before the battle, they're stuck there for the fight, that's where they are, and you have to work around them and try to get the enemy to come near them to actually use them. And imagine all the kind of stuff you could do in Warhammer with traps, with Skaven engineering and bombs and mines and flamethrowers and whatever else. There could be some fun to be had there. And then when the attacker starts to get onto the walls, the wall phase of the siege would begin, where you couldn't just run off the wall straight away. You had to stand there and fight and grind your way down, and this is where some tactics could be used as the defender, because there's no magic elevators. You jump off this wall, you're breaking your legs, son, so you gotta stay up there. The only way to get down from the wall is to actually go to a certain point in the wall like this, where there are stairs which you go down and then you come out the bottom in a little tunnel. And this would provide some tactical play. As the defender, you could try and block this up and hold the enemy up on the wall, or as the attacker, you could keep running around the wall if they had blocked it up and come out somewhere else. And when they are stuck up there, you can then blast them with missiles when you've got them trapped up on the wall. There's some tactical play to be had there. But that's all gone with Total War Warhammer, because any unit can get off of the wall wherever they like. I'd be really curious to see what Total War Warhammer Sieges were like if they had these kind of walls. You know, ones that could actually stop an attacker getting in the settlement. Oh, and by the way, these walls had destructibility. They wouldn't just be destroyed when they took too much damage, they would have phases of damage. Madness, huh? But comparable to Total War Warhammer, there was a lot of choke point fights going on in Total War Rome 2. But as I said, these somehow were kind of more fun, and I didn't kind of get bored as I do in Total War Warhammer. So what's different? Well, I think that comes down to the core of the game and the units and how that all works, and the features that were available to play with during a siege, such as boats. There was of course naval combat in Rome 2 and many other Total Wars, and those boats could be used to bring in units to the shore of a settlement if it happened to be a coastal settlement, of course, and thus it gave you this different element to manage in your siege battle, and these ships would very often land in, would you believe it, open space, where you can actually move your units around. And much like in Shogun 2, there were built-in arrow towers which you could capture and take off the enemy, and they would fire arrows for you instead. And like I said, something you can fight over for strategic benefit. I think another thing that keeps Sieges interesting in older Total War is all the stances and abilities that you have to actively manage and use. Like this unit that I can put into Shield Wall. They'll get tighter, they'll get tougher and more defensive and last longer. Or an ability like Frenzy, which is in Total War Warhammer, right? But it's a passive, so you don't have to do anything. Whereas in Rome 2 and other historical Total Wars, these were activatable abilities that if you wanted Frenzy, you had to go and click a button to get them to do it. Thus, there was some tactical management there. And that was the case with a lot of units. Some units have it in Warhammer, but most don't. Whereas it's the other way around in these older Total Wars. And the same with missile units. They'd have fire arrows, they'd have whistling arrows, and you'd have to select them. And look at this, actual space in a siege settlement. I've got cavalry in here, I can move them around to set up a tactical flanking maneuver. This just happens to be one of the more spacious maps, not all of them are like this. But it's certainly more fun to have a bit of a mixture of more open field battle areas and more choke pointy battle areas. Both can be fun, just in the right amounts. If you have too much open space, then it's basically just a land battle, and if you have too many choke points, then it's just kind of boring and too grindy. Whereas a map like this is a nice mixture of both. There's also some cool bits and bobs from other Total Wars as well. Attila had this fire mechanic where you could light the settlement on fire and it would kind of spread. Not really an essential thing, but it was nice to look at and made the whole thing feel very siegey overall. There was also civilians walking around in some settlements in older Total Wars as well, and they would even try to come at you. Watch this lady as she tries her luck with a berserker and ends up getting herself beheaded. This is by no means an essential feature, but it's certainly just a nice little thing to give a bit of life to the settlements. Three Kingdoms had a few bits and bobs with barricades. They were in set places, so they weren't completely free-form placement, like Rome 2, and I can understand AI pathfinding might struggle, so preset locations is fine. But it did actually have some free-form placement for deployables, like these little spikes here. You could place them wherever the hell you like, thus allowing you to make your own little defensive plans and come up with some creative ways to use these traps and things. So personally, I'd like to see this system just maybe a bit more elaborated on in the future. Although I do understand, of course, AI limitations, and we can understand why with Total War Warhammer this kind of thing might be a problem because there's so many different types of units with monstrous infantry and single large monsters and flying units and magic. Implementing some of these kind of systems might be difficult. Overall with Three Kingdoms, the sieges were okay, but they kind of suffered the same kind of stuff as Warhammer does. The walls were all scalable by any infantry, like so. So it was kind of met with the same fate, that it was kind of oversimplified overall, and thus they didn't really feel that exciting to play. And were also quite choke point heavy. But there we go, I've rambled on long enough. I'd like to see some of the changes to Total War Sieges reverted to how they used to be. I think that's pretty much the gist of it, but I think there's definitely the opportunity for some better systems to maybe come into place. Just please don't give us goddamn deployable arrow towers anymore. These are just my opinions based on complete ignorance. I know nothing of game design or the technical challenges that may be faced with implementing all the kind of stuff I'm asking for. But I think I've identified what I like and don't like in Sieges, and well, here it is. Let me know if you agree or disagree or what you think. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing what the modders do as well, actually, with Sieges. I'll see you in the future.